Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Right Mind podcast brought to you by the Institute of European Right here in Vilnius, Lithuania. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure today to present to you our dear guest, Mr. Reinhard Kloucek from Austria, who is the president of the Pan-European Movement in Austria right now. Mr. Reinhard, it's a great honor to have you here today.
It's a great honor for me being here. Thanks for the invitation.
And we're recording this podcast on February 19th, so we have a lot of things going on right now geopolitically. But stepping aside from that, Austria... I'm not sure all of our listeners know what exactly the Pan-European movement is. So maybe a short historical brief would be useful to many of them, and especially in Lithuania. I checked out before our discussion here. Information that is presented in the encyclopedias and so on is very limited to what really is the Pan-European movement, and with its rich history. And Austria, of course, it's the country at the heart of the movement, you can say, culturally, intellectually, and so on. So a short introduction to what the Pan-European movement is.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Paneuropa is the oldest organization for the European unification. It was founded in 1922, so almost more than 100 years ago, by a young man with the name Reinhard Coudenhove-Kalergi. So this was after the end of World War I, with the split up of the old empire into small national states and a lot of protectionism and nationalism and revanchism. And for Coudenhove at that time it was clear that if we don't find some kind of way, some way of unification, we will go into a new war, which would be much more horrible than the First World War I was. And so he developed this idea of his concept, which he published in November 22, Paneuropa, a proposal in which he said, okay, we have to find some kind of unification, cooperation, get rid of all these protectionist measures. And I would say his approach was a geopolitical approach, because he saw that on the one side, the United States of America, on the other side, Russia, at that time, Soviet Union, two strong powers, they would somehow influence or even dominate Europe. He once said, the United States want to buy us, Russia wants to conquer us. And we want to play our own role on the stage of world politics, so we have to find this way into unification. And in the center of his concept, I would say, was a foreign and security policy. Didn't want to regulate everything on the European level, but we have to find a common foreign and security policy, a big internal market, and yes, there was also the idea of a common currency at that time, and also this idea of freedom, of liberty, so a continent of free people in a democratic system and a free market economy and rule of law. So these things which are now also called the European values somehow.
Well, it's interesting, of course, that at that time the ideas were mainly received by intellectual elites who wanted to adhere to a more common European project, and you can be Austrian and European at the same time. It was very clear, I think, for the intellectual and aristocratic elite of the beginning of the 20th century. But of course we had the Second World War, we had the Iron Curtain splitting the continent later on, and so we learned all these lessons, especially about revanchism, about very narrow nationalism, which goes into conflict with other nationalisms. We learned those lessons the hard way, and of course then from those hard lessons, then we sort of returned to that idea from a very practical standpoint of view, which now became the European Union. How do you see the importance of the pan-European movement towards establishing what became the European Union in the latter half of the 20th century.
When you go back to the beginning of what is now the European Union, so the European Union for coal and steel, this was done by other people. Yeah, we have to accept that. But there was, of course, this happened directly after World War II. And up to the beginning of World War II, Coudenhove-Kalergi was active in European politics, knew most of the politicians, so he had contacts with statesmen at that time who started to talk about a common Europe. For example, the speech of Winston Churchill was influenced by Coudenhove-Kalergi. They have been in touch during the war, etc. There were also others. And Coudenhove then was still very active because he made proposals for example, for the European anthem, for the European flag. This was proposals coming from him, and then via other peoples then became more famous. But I would say, yes, there was an influence, but of course then it became what we call realpolitik. This was then the job of the political parties and all the politicians. But what is very important, I think, and we have to mention that especially when we are here in this country, because there were some pan-Europeans in the Baltic countries between the two world wars, and Paneuropa was one of the organizations which always said we have to overcome this Iron Curtain. We have to bring back the Russians to where they belong to Moscow. We have to end the colonial empire and the countries which were occupied by Hitler-Stalin Pact from the Soviet Union, and then later, as a result of the war, also by the Soviet Union, they have to get back their freedom. And finally, it was the so-called pan-European picnic in 1989, where then the beginning of the end of the Iron Curtain started.
Well, few details about Lithuanian perspective on the pan-European movement. Between the two wars, intellectually, there was great interest in moving towards a European federation. Maybe first starting with the Baltic states and with the Nordics, the Nordic-Baltic kind of alliance, but then moving to a more broader European cooperation, and actually even Lithuanian, center-right Christian democratic intellectuals in exile who lived in Germany and United States after World War II, they were also writing that in the future, for Europe to remain a continent relevant and to protect individual freedoms, freedoms of communities, freedoms of beliefs, and national sovereignty, a European federation should be the way to go. So what they viewed is that this cooperation between European countries increases sovereignty, not decreases it. Yeah.
That's exactly the point. I mean, small states are small states and will always be dominated by superpowers. But Europe could become a superpower if we cooperate. Doesn't mean that we need a bureaucratic superstate, but we need a cooperation in the core topics of what a state is. This is foreign policy, this is security policy, and this is the rule of law. And that's what we still are advocating for.
Well, I think it's very much important and needed to have this discussion in Europe again, because, for example, in Lithuania, we're a very Euro-optimistic country. If you would look at the sociology, traditionally, everyone is very happy and was, for us, first of all, joining the European Union, and always been very optimistic. So a lot of good change has come from joining Europe politically. But now, when we see security threats from Russia, when we see the United States becoming more unpredictable, and of course, other kinds of challenges, demographic challenges, economic challenges to Europe, we now, I think, need a broad European discussion. Do we really have a common vision geopolitically? Do we really have a common market? This was always one of the goals in Europe, to have free movement of capital, people, and ideas. And do we really have that? So there's a lot of, still questions.
And it's going to be more questions because the challenges are coming. And I mean, it's a normal reaction that when a new challenge or even a new threat comes, that people come back and hide somewhere behind a wall. And this wall for them is still the national state. But when you look on the web of world politics, I think it doesn't make sense. Yeah, because if you take a small country like Austria, yes, we can say we are neutral. But all in all, if we don't cooperate with other European countries and be a part of, or are a part of this European Union, then we are lost somewhere. The problem I see is that somehow in the capitals of the European Union countries, we have lost this European spirit. I'll give you one example. In the, 70s, 80s, when Portugal, Spain, and Greece became members of the European community, they had a military regime before that. The Commission said, no, they are not ready for negotiations to become members. But the Council said, so the head of states of the member countries said, this is a political process. We wanted to establish a democratic, free market, rule of law rule in these countries, so we have to talk to them to integrate them into this system of European values. And what we see now is, we're talking about, you remember Thessaloniki 2003, more than 20 years ago, we're talking about the accession of the Balkan countries to the European Union. And whenever one problem is solved, or seems to be solved, somebody comes and says, but I have another question. Why don't we put the Bulgarian majority population into the constitution of North Macedonia? To give you one example. Yeah? So there is no longer this spirit that we try to integrate these countries in this zone of freedom, in this zone of rule of law, in this zone of democracy. We are creating problems but not solving them. And I think especially in these topics, it's also a job of us as Pan-Europeans to make clear that it's not about, of course it's important to know that there are also Bulgarians in North Macedonia. No problem with that. But this is not the point why to block the country.
Yeah, I think exactly, and looking at a lot of conflicts have been solved through European integration concerning, for example, border regions, sensitive issues, for example, between the Czech Republic and Poland, and so on. We have plenty of good examples how cooperation between neighboring countries when joining the European family helps to solve these issues, not escalate them.
When you see the result of joining or integrating these countries into European, the enlargement process is the success story of the European Union. It's better for both sides. We had a border between North Tyrol and South Tyrol, Italy and Austria. Who cares about this border now? Yeah. Nobody. A friend of mine is active in local politics in Upper Austria, Salzburg region, together with Bavaria. There are communities where they shared schools, yeah? So you have one part of the school in the Austrian side and the other part of the school in the Bavarian side, even for the firefighters, yeah? The one has the big one and the other one has the smaller car, but more the specialist, etc. And this cooperation was working. And then we had COVID and everybody started to close the borders and wanted to believe that if we establish border controls, then everything will be fine. No, it was worse.
Well, and another, of course, big question now surrounding, of course, there are optimists, for example, like the long-time chairman of the Homeland Union party in Lithuania, Andrius Kubilius, was always the optimist and saying every crisis makes the European Union stronger, and, new challenges, they demand us to sort of to man up and try to solve them. And now his vision is that maybe our response to the current security crisis will be a stronger European Union that has an element of military security to it as well, to protect those other economic freedoms, democracy, rule of law, and so on. But, talking about European enlargement, Ukraine, and I remember very clearly already in 2004 and in 2014, people going to the streets with the European Union flags. And they were fighting, and some of them lost their lives, with the ideals of Europe and the ambition of joining the European Union as an existential choice. And looking to what you said in the capitals of Europe, there's a lot less of belief in the European ideals than by people who are on the outside and want in.
Yes, they are outside, they know what they are looking for. And people in the capitals of the European Union countries somehow forgot what they have with the European Union. The spirit is still there. We have to reinvent it or reorganize it to bring it more into politics. Especially this security threat we are facing. It was clear for many people, especially here in the eastern part of the European Union, that Moscow is a colonial empire and that this empire will try to get back its old colonies. It was clearly said by Putin and others for a long time. But to give you an example from a discussion with a lady from France working there for a geopolitical think tank and a friend of Spain, when they talk about geopolitics, then the French are talking about la grande nation, and the Spanish are thinking about Latin America. So Latin America, which is on the other side of the Atlantic, is closer to them than Russia, which is now the big threat to Europe. And somehow we have to find a common European perspective, to see the problems which are challenging us, and to find a European solution, not only these fragmented solutions or ideas which come from the different regions of Europe. It's good that we have relations with Latin America. I'm very much pro, for example, Mercosur. But at the same time, especially this security issue is dominating now.
And I think another aspect to it is exactly, we talk a lot, especially about NATO and the ambiguity, of course, with the Trump administration. One day they see one thing, another they see another thing. Austria, of course, is not a NATO member yet. Well, hopefully someday. But for example, Finland and Sweden joined recently, and it was a difficult process, the accession process, a lot of barriers that needed to be overcome, political barriers, and so on. But there's also, and then stocks, if Russia tries to hybrid attack on one of the NATO members, will Article 5 work? Or will we have enough deterrence in place? But there's not enough discussions. What happens when Russia attacks or does a hybrid attack or conducts some kind of action against a European Union country, which is part of the Schengen zone, which is part of the Eurozone. So how will the European political project be affected by this? That would mean probably collapse of open borders in Schengen territory. It would probably be a huge hit to the euro and any kind of perspectives of a more unified financial European market again. So we talk a lot about NATO and this sort of security infrastructure, but the implications for the European Union could be even more dire than to NATO. So I would want to hear your thoughts on this aspect of the European Union and the challenges.
We already have these hybrid attacks, and we have the cyber attacks. They are happening not on a daily basis, but they are happening, and to all European countries, also to a neutral country like Austria. And when speaking from an Austrian perspective, it's always interesting to see how, many people in Austria really believe that neutrality is protecting us from any attacks. And when they then tell them, listen, let's talk about Islamic terrorism. It happens in Austria. Let's talk about cyber attacks. It happened to Austria. Where is our neutrality? And this is not only some hacker somewhere in the world who is a little bit crazy, but this is done by Russia. These hybrid attacks are also done by Russia. It was Russia which reduced the gas flow to Austria before the attack or the full invasion to Ukraine. This is all reality. But as long as people live in their own bubble, they believe, oh no, this cannot be because we are neutral. And that's from an Austrian perspective, it's extremely not only difficult but also politically dangerous if you come and say, okay, let's talk about NATO accession. If you do that, then you are losing the next elections. That's why nobody is really talking about it. And the pan-European approach has always been, okay, there is the United States of America, these are our partners, but Europe has to be able to have its own security policy. Not against America, but together with America. We are the so-called Western world. We will see if in Austria we can trigger such a discussion. I don't know, but the big problem at the moment is not only Austria. The big problem is much more countries like Hungary or also Slovakia, which are in NATO, which are in the European Union, and playing a dirty game with Putin's Russia. So we have the enemy, and this is not diplomatic what I'm now saying, but we have the diplomatic inside our house.
Yeah, it's a very big issue, and the lack of response towards this animosity. Again, I mean, on the one hand, Hungary is using all the benefits of being in the European Union, but then on the other hand, when it's not ideologically in the interests of Viktor Orban or sometimes Vladimir Putin, they're sabotaging the whole political project. So, and they're always criticizing the European Union for this and that, and Brussels is dictating this and that, but they don't leave, because the benefits are so.
That's exactly the point. I had a discussion with a Hungarian politician, and I said, okay, so what are you doing? You say you are neutral in an economic way, so you can make deals with everybody. Fine with me. This is the one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin is you are part of NATO, you are part of the European Union, you are protected by these alliances, as well as EU, as well as with NATO, and without this protection, you would be the slave of Vladimir Putin tomorrow. Nobody would protect you in a crisis. So you are misusing this membership. He was not very happy about this because I confronted him in the public with that. And then he came to me and said, yeah, but don't you know, they have nukes. And I said, okay, yes, they have nukes. I know that they have nukes. They had nukes in the Cold War. We did not surrender to them. What are I doing? Why do I do it? Yeah, so somehow, I don't know. Of course, yes, when you're Austrian, then you know that the history with Hungary was always a little bit difficult because they are Hungarians and they have their national interests and they have a language which nobody speaks in the rest of the world, only the Hungarians. So they always feel that they are misunderstood, which is very easy to misunderstand them. But even accepting that they have their own national interest, they must also see that there is a common European interest that only together we can face this threat coming from Moscow. And not only Moscow, it's also China.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of discussions are only beginning. Of course, Lithuania has been a little bit, in terms of, for example, our dealings with China, maybe a little bit ahead of the curve. And again, we were the first to experience sanctions, unannounced sanctions from China.
Because you left this Road and Belt Initiative.
Yeah, and not only that, we allowed to open the Taiwanese representative office, which is an economic entity, not a diplomatic entity in Vilnius, and the response was very, very, very critical, because exactly it was Taiwanese, not Taipei's, but Taiwanese, and the opening up of ties with Taiwan angered the Communist Party of China very much, and so
I can imagine.
yeah, but they are acting in a hostile manner very much towards Europe. Again, stealing intellectual property of European companies. European companies that came in to China with joint ventures and investments. Then they take the intellectual property and says, "Thank you very much. You can leave now. We will build your trains under a different brand, and we will export them in Southeast Asia, and we are no longer needed of you," and so on and so on. So, this discussion has been going on for some time, but we're still, we're lacking a way to address it properly for what it is, that China is acting in a hostile manner.
It's a totalitarian regime, let's face it. The same as Russia is a totalitarian regime now.
And that's another part, I think, important, what has been maybe forgotten when we talk about the broader European ideal, is that trade, political cooperation, security cooperation cannot be done between democracies and authoritarian and totalitarian regimes which do not respect personal freedoms, basic human rights, and so on.
Because, not on the same level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, well, you can have, it's necessary. A lot of technical things and trade is necessary in a globalized world, of course. But to have real trust, and these soft factors like human rights, rule of law, have been, I think, again, by the political elites, and the same goes for part of Lithuanian political elites, been neglected for maybe a little bit far too long.
We had this, in German it's called Wandel durch Handel, so change by trade, which is, from an economic point of view, well, it sounds logical, because if we trade with each other, we are not going to kill each other. Doesn't make sense to kill you when I want to make business with you. But you always have to know that, especially in authoritarian or especially in totalitarian regimes, that the partner is not on the same level as you are. So he is taking the advantage, but finally misusing your trust in him and your trust in this change by trade to then overcome you and attack you. But there is this old saying from Lenin, what is it? We will sell them the
rope.
On which we will hang them. Yeah. And this is what Putin did with gas, or tried with gas and oil.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the mistake was of trade through change was exactly that. On the European side, we have private economic enterprises, corporations, private companies going into trade. And on the side of Russia and China, it's very hard sometimes to draw the line where it's private capital and where it's the state. And especially when we talk about oil and gas in Russia, it's the state. It's not, you're not trading with other private entities. So there's exactly what you mentioned, this asymmetry. There's this lack of reciprocity. And exactly, when there's lack of rule of law, when there's lack of diversification and sort of separating economical and political powers, then this model that we will trade and therefore we will not go to war with each other, it does not function.
Exactly. But this has to be realized. We have the situation now that I think Mercedes-Benz is going to the European court because of tariffs against China. because they have economic interests there, but they are part of a joint venture which is controlled somehow by China. Yeah. Also, private investors have to see the political reality. You can only do private business if you have a rule of law. In China, you don't have a rule of law because it's totalitarian. Same in Russia, you don't have rule of law, you have one who decides. And in the meantime, you don't have any private enterprise. Well, on the paper, it is private. But in reality, this is one organization which is controlling everything. And everything is under the rule of the Khan, the great Khan Vladimir, to expand the empire. That's the goal.
Well, yeah, and I think also looking more broadly to what are the interests of European countries, that on the one hand, we are living in a very globalized world. Economically, like even the United States of America, which is a economic superpower, a military superpower, they cannot completely isolate themselves from the world. It's impossible because they need to import a lot of things from outside the world. They need trade relations and so on. And this sort of Pax Americana that existed with the securing of trade lanes and so on was for the benefit of the United States. Somehow now they're saying, well, is it towards the benefit of us? I don't know. It's a very strange discussion. But we see now also we are in a perplexing situation, or what already we mentioned with Hungary and Slovakia. On the one hand, we're using all the benefits of the globalized world, of the globalized economy. On the other hand, we have these isolationist ideas that we should somehow decouple from each other and start to, move away. And it's very strange. But of course, the other perspective is that our geopolitical rivals, Russia, China, Iran, they are seeing themselves as allied in a certain cause against the proverbial collective West. And there is a real rivalry here, which we are not addressing. Again, they are allied, and we're still discussing maybe we can trade with them, be friendly here, and maybe if they push us there, we would sort of ignore it. So it's a very sort of perplexing situation that we don't address what is actually going on. That's my opinion.
I mean, trade is good. Globalization is also good. And the discussion, or what we see now, is when Trump comes with tariffs, etc. This reminds me of the time 100 years ago when Paneuropa was founded. What happened? There was a big empire, but it was not only a big empire, it was also a big market, a free market zone. And then everybody, or every country, had, of course, economic problems. That's logical. So what did they do? They tried to create new borders, economic borders, against the others to protect their own economy. This is what Trump now says.
Tariffs and limitations.
The result was, it was worse for everybody, because it doesn't work. So if you have countries with rule of law, with democracy, I mean, it's normal that you trade, and if you can buy cheaper products from outside the countries, your own countries, why not do it? It makes it cheaper for the consumers in your country. The point is only, if you are dealing with a totalitarian regime, you have to know that's a totalitarian regime, and that there is an asymmetry, that you cannot talk with them on the same level, because they have a completely other understanding of what trade means. I mean, China clearly says that they have their own idea of human rights. What does that mean? This is not our way of life. This is a way of life where they try to get control over us, as the government in China is controlling the people via social credit systems and whatever they have. And they do it also in our countries, by the way, for the Chinese who are living there.
Yeah, but it's this threat from it's also, I think, not only political, but also a cultural threat for our ideals and identity. What we build on the sort of the core values of not only the European political and cultural project, but also the sort of global movement towards the betterment of the human condition, of human rights, university, and so on. And pretty soon, I think we can start to see backsliding on a lot of the improvements that were achieved by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, if we not sort of reformulate our belief in these sort of core humanistic values.
Yeah, of course, the panel is always pendling left and right, but we should not stop this process of having a free world and having a free trade and having a globalization by then believing, okay, now we had globalization and now we completely cut it down. No, this is not the right way. And that's also the challenge for your think tank, our organization, all these organizations, parties, whatever it is in the political sphere, who stand for freedom, who stand for liberty, to make clear that, okay, yes, if there is something going into the wrong direction, then we can correct it, but don't kill it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming to our podcast and sharing your ideas and bringing more clarity to how a true pan-European sees our current situation. And I just remind the listeners of the Right Mind podcast that today we were honored to have Mr. Reinhard Kloucek as our guest. He is the president of the Pan-European Movement in Austria, and the podcast has been brought to you by the Institute of European Right here in Vilnius, Lithuania. Thank you, and see you again in further editions.
Thank you. It was a great honor for me.